Um, I thought I would just start off this morning with some feedback and some time for questions in terms of the practice types that we've been doing. I was just mentioning to Diane in an email that not the most recent types, but the one before that, have all been audio checked by Josie. The only thing is I think she's forgotten to email them back to me. So certainly at lunchtime, if not before, we'll have those tasks back to you. And thank you very much for doing those. Once again, from the brief look that I had, they're looking fantastic, and it's just really small things that I think you'll find feedback from Josie on. So I thought after that feedback, just to give you a bit of an idea of how this morning is going to run, I wanted to quickly recap all of the macros that we've talked about that we use for criminal. And so we'll just be looking at that VGRS Word macros ribbon just to make sure that everyone knows what's there and everyone has the opportunity to ask any lingering questions about those macros. And the reason that I wanted to talk about that in criminal is because then this morning I'd like to talk a bit about civil. Now, civil has kind of been the rejected cousin of criminal throughout this week. We've focused almost exclusively on criminal, and as we've said before, that's because it's so fiddly that EPIC prefers to train on criminal first, also because then we have recourse to the manual, so it's a sort of easier way to do it. And when we move to civil, you'll see that almost all of the conventions are the same. You just type a little bit more because there are fewer things that you don't type than in criminal. So we'll talk a little bit about civil, and as part of that, I'd like to go through the transcript ribbon macros that we would use for civil, just for the same reasons. If you have any questions about them, you can ask them, and we can make sure that we know what resources are there for us in terms of macros. The other thing that I'd like to do this morning, after we've sort of introduced civil a little more, is just to go over again what we do and don't type in criminal and civil, because that's where it gets a little bit confusing. And so I think it'll be good just to clarify that. And I'm hoping that we're not going to take up the full 2 hours, that we can finish a bit before lunch and give you some time to maybe do that practice type of the ruling. Then after lunch, just to give you a bit more of an idea of where the day is going, I'd like to very briefly introduce the Magistrates Court to all of us. Now, this will be a very brief introduction, and I'm mainly going to focus on some of the oddities of typing the Magistrates Court in criminal, because as you'll find when you start typing the Magistrates Court later on, the civil jurisdiction is pretty much the same as we're used to, but the criminal jurisdiction has a few differences that are good to note. And the reason that I'm going to briefly introduce the Magistrates Court is Kat had mentioned to me a little bit earlier this week that we've got a lot of magistrates matters on over the next couple of weeks. We tend to get all of these jobs in chunks. So we'll go from having nothing in criminal magistrates to having, I don't know, 20 at once. And they're quite good to train on as well. So it's possible that over the coming weeks, Kat might allocate you a magistrate's task. It's not particularly different, but as I said, I just like to note a couple of the differences with you this morning, so it's not a complete surprise to you if that does turn out to be the case. And then after we've introduced the Magistrates Court, I'd really like to have time just to open the floor for anything that we've discussed this week that you'd like more information on, clarification on, any questions you may have, pretty much anything. The time can be yours, because of course we are at Friday now. And so I really want to make sure that if there are questions burning in your mind, we have the time to answer them. And following that, as we come towards 3:30, I would just like to make sure again that you're really clear on all the resources that you have access to as a typist. I had some great questions from one of you this morning about resources, about manual resources, and that's something that I'm going to bring up with Kat today, just to make sure that if we have any other documents that might be useful to you, we can send them through. I can tell you as a typist, my main document is the VGRS manual, and we've sent through a couple of other things this week along the way, like the how to set up footers document, the arraignment document, but I just want to make sure with Kat that if we have anything else to give you, you've got it. so that if you have questions along the way, there's another resource for you to look to. And then after that, I'll more or less be bidding you farewell for the weekend. As you would have seen in the email that I sent last night, I've nominated another task that I think it might be useful for you to have a look at. First of all, the second segment that I nominated is actually great if you have the whole day and the transcript, because there's just a lot going on in it. So I think if you'll remember, I mentioned that we've got in there discussion, we've got tendering of exhibits, we've got jury events, we've got witnesses, we've got a very difficult to understand witness. All of these things, I think, make it a good task to have a little bit of a scroll through with the transcript and then to have a go typing. And just to finish off the day as well, if there is anything that you would like more practice on, I will take requests and I'll have a look this afternoon to see if I can nominate segments of audio that I think would be really useful for you to practice. Perfect. Does anyone have any questions on how the day is going to run at this stage? Not by the looks of things. Fantastic. In that case, let's launch straight into it. I've got a few things that I would like to mention just really quickly in terms of feedback from the excellent typing that you've been doing. But before I do, does anybody have any general typing questions, having done now several practice types over the last few days? Not by the sounds of it, no worries at all. What I'm going to do is just share my screen now, and I'm just going to mention a couple of really small points. You know you're working with excellent trainees and potentially trainees with a bit of experience when the things that you're bringing up in terms of feedback are this small. So I'm just going to pull up a blank Word document just in case I need it. Here we go. The first thing I just wanted to remind everybody on, and I think I only saw maybe 1 or 2 instances of this when I was glancing through the types that you sent through, was that when we have a witness giving evidence via an interpreter, we use to witness. So you'll remember that parenthetical notation to witness in a very specific way. And I just wanted to remind you when we can't use it. So for the most part, you're using it fine as you are just at the moment. Say we had, for example, His Honour asking a question of the witness. His Honour said, or actually, we've got Mr. Lawyer asking the question. I finally added in the shortcuts last night so you don't have to watch me laboriously type in Mr. Lawyer every time I do this. We've got Mr. Lawyer asking a question. Did you do it? Witness says, no, I didn't. Then His Honour butts in and says, hang on, I thought you were going to ask something else. Now, clearly here he's talking to the lawyer. Fix format, because you can see I've lost my little margin in there. The lawyer says, no, I'm going to ask this. And His Honour says, okay then. And then the lawyer goes straight back into asking another question, or asking the same one. Did you do it? No. There is no need in an exchange like this to pop to witness at the start of the question after he's been talking to the judge. So just a reminder, really we use to witness more or less in the middle of one person's response. So if, for example, Mr. Lawyer down here said, yes, that's right, Your Honour, and then immediately said, did you do it to the witness, this would be a perfect opportunity to chuck in to witness in here, because we've gone from a response to the judge to another question to the witness, and the lawyer hasn't used the name of the witness to make it clear in the transcript who he's talking to. So usually it's sort of in the middle that we're using to witness. As I said before, there's no reason, if there's no further response to the judge, he just goes straight back into asking the witness a question. to put it right after Mr. Lawyer in the margin. And that's probably a good way to remember this, is that we never start with to witness. So we never have someone's name in the margin and then start with to witness after that if what follows is just the question. Now, it's sort of a hard one to remember in some ways because why? Why don't we ever put it at the start? It seems to me it would be a good way to make it even clearer in the transcript that what was coming was speech towards somebody else than we've just been talking to. But that's just the way the VGRS prefers it. So takeaway message, if you've got a name in the margin, we never directly follow it with to witness, even if the person in the margin has just been talking to someone else. It's really just if it's halfway through, as we can see before. Yes, that's right, Your Honour. And then immediately starts talking to the witness. We can use to witness in there. And just to reiterate what we said before, if he says, yes, that's right, Your Honour, and then turns to the witness and says, Mr. Witness, oh, hello. Mr. Witness, did you do it? Again, no reason to use to witness because it's obvious from the name. Now, another thing just to mention on that, when I started typing, I thought the to witness notation meant that there was kind of a free-for-all to do to other people in the transcript. Possibly this is obvious to you, but I just want to mention it because it wasn't obvious to me. So when I started typing, when I came up against other things in the text, so for example, the honour may be, his honour, the judge may be talking to a lawyer and then turning around and talking to his tip staff, I might have put, his honour, yes, Mr. Lawyer. And then he turns to the tip staff and says, do you have that document? And I would put in here, the tip staff. Never do that. In terms of the VGRS manual, we can only use the notation to witness. We don't use to tip staff, we don't use to defence lawyer, we don't use to juror. We can really only use the examples that are given in the manual, and we're not really allowed to riff on them. So that's just a little point there in case you're like me and you thought that was just a carte blanche to type whatever you wanted to make things clearer in the transcript. No, unfortunately not. Does anybody have any questions on that before I move on? I'm getting good at looking in the corner to see if anyone's microphones are turning on. So
if for some reason, the judge is speaking to someone else and then the judge speaks to the witness, can we use to witness if the judge speaks, or is it just reserved for the lawyers?
That's a really great question. Thank you so much for that, Monique. You absolutely can use it for the judge as well. That's perfectly fine. As long as it's the same sort of circumstances we've just been describing here, and that happens all the time, then yes, you absolutely can use it with the judge. You'll find, and in fact, you probably have noticed already, having done a little bit of practice typing on witness evidence on Q&A, that sometimes the judge will more or less keep out of the different phases of witness evidence. And then every now and again, you'll have a judge who will be really hands-on, sometimes to the point where it's a little bit embarrassing for the lawyer, who's the one who's supposed to be asking the questions, can get a little bit awkward. So when you're typing witness evidence, stacks of occasions, you'll have the judge asking a lot of questions and then talking to the lawyer, or you'll have the lawyer asking a lot of questions and then talking to the judge. So yes, absolutely fine to use to witness when it's the judge who's speaking. Great question, thank you. The next tiny weeny little thing that I wanted to mention is just in terms of, also in Q&A, this is just a tiny weeny little formatting thing. Just a reminder, and I think I only saw this maybe twice, so it's quite possible it was just a typo. And I mean twice in all of the practice types that I had a quick look at. When we have Q&A, so for example, Mr. Lawyer saying, did you do it? And then we have our little Control L, which gives us the question mark and 3 dashes. Just remember after that, just go directly into the answer. So we would say, no, I didn't. There's no need to chuck an extra space in there after the Control L before the response. That's just a tiny weeny little thing. Of course, we do use spaces sometimes if, for example, we have an interpreter, and they've been speaking through the interpreter up to now, but for this particular question, they want to answer really vehemently, and they're going to do it directly. So as we know, we can start off an answer with direct if it's interpreted, and then of course, as I'm sure you're all doing already, we would have a space after that followed by no, I didn't, if it's the witness giving a direct response in English. Just on interpreted evidence, I had a really excellent question from, I think it was Diane, maybe yesterday or the day before, all the days are running together, just about when to use direct and when to use through interpreter. I just wanted to reiterate that we really only use the direct notation if the witness has enough English to have, one, understood the question posed in English without having to wait for the interpreter, and two, knows a sufficient amount of English to immediately respond in English, if that makes sense. So sometimes it can get a little bit difficult to know, should I be using direct here or should I be using through interpreter? You might remember that one of the practice types we did, the witness clearly understood English quite or even very well. And so they would ask the question in English and she'd be nodding and you could see that she understood. Usually she'd wait for the interpreter to interpret and then respond. But a lot of the time she would say, yeah, in response to the question, and then the interpreter would translate it as yes. Instances like that, it can be difficult to know whether or not you should use direct or through interpreter. But I really think a good rule of thumb is that they have to have sort of not waited for the question to be translated, or after the question has been translated, they need to respond in very clear English without the use of the interpreter, if that makes sense. So if you have any questions over that over the day that occur, please just let me know, because sometimes it's just a matter as a typist of making a judgment call.
So you did just make me think of something then. So in that case, when the witness understood and said yeah, but then the interpreter said yes, what exactly do you transcribe? Do you transcribe both or just the interpreter?
That's a great question. I would just transcribe the interpreter. And the reason for that is because for that particular witness, for every single question, she was waiting for the whole question to be interpreted, and the interpreter was consistently translating what the witness said. Even though there isn't a great deal of difference between yeah and yes, I think because they were following the format so completely, I would continue to type what it was that the interpreter was saying. If, for example, though that had been happening and then we came to a question and the interpreter translated it all, and then that particular witness said, yes, I'm going to respond in English this time, then obviously we would be using direct there. But I think for everything else, because the questions were being consistently translated into the language and the witness was then consistently responding and having her response translated, I don't think there's any reason to use direct. It's not very substantive, so I think it makes more sense just to keep going with what the interpreter was saying. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. It can be a bit tricky, and I think the more that you type interpreted evidence, the more that it will become sort of second nature to make those judgment calls yourself. But just keep in mind as well, if you're ever unsure, and I still get unsure sometimes with really tricky interpreted evidence, just ask other typists to have a listen. Or when really in doubt, just get on Spark to the TCs. They're so lovely and they're so willing to, lend you their opinion or their advice. Beautiful. Also on interpreted evidence, this is something that we briefly touched on the other day, but I think it's worth mentioning again. And actually, this is something that I personally am still refining in my own typing. When we have witness evidence and the lawyer, every single question has a sort of verbal tick at the start. So for example, at the start of every single question, they say, all right. So did you do it? Or they say, all right. And what about this? And all right is at the start of every single question, unless it is really important to the meaning. So say they've said something before and he's saying all right because he's accepting what they're saying and in an important sort of way, I would leave out the all right because it's just a verbal tick. And to be honest, you can even go so far sometimes as leaving out the ands at the start of every question. There's lots of examples like this. So things like well at the start of every question, okay at the start of every question, and at the start of every question, even so. I'm trying to think of other examples. All right is a really common one. Yes at the start of every single question. If you're noticing as you're typing each subsequent question that these are coming up at the start of every single one, I would go through and omit them because it makes for a cleaner transcript. Now, if you're not very experienced in typing witness evidence and you're worried that what you're omitting might change the meaning of the question, then please by all means leave it in. But if it's very obviously a verbal tick, feel free to omit it. So you'll see this all the time. Mr. Lawyer starts his examination. All right. So did you do it? And the witness says, no. All right. Were you at the house that night? No. Excuse me, I misspelled house. All right. But what about the other house? Etc., etc. We can see all right, all right, all right. And knowing Mr. Lawyer, he's probably going to continue doing that. So I would literally just go back through. All right. All right. I might leave the first one, but again, that's a judgment call. So then you can see that when you're reading the transcript, it looks a lot cleaner and you get straight to the start of the question. Same with, I'm just going to mention the and example because that one's a bit, I guess can be a bit trickier because it's not a self-contained thing. It seems like it's part of a question. So if you had, and where were you that night? And what about the other house? And did you see so-and-so? And what were they wearing? Etc., etc. Again, for stylistic purposes, I would go through and get rid of the ands. Now, this is tricky to know because it's another thing that isn't in the VGRS manual. This is just something that we do stylistically because we have people working at EPIC who have worked for VGRS for many years and know the conventions and know what's preferred. And we also get feedback from VGRS at fairly regular intervals. So because we are contracted to do that work, VGRS will quality check the work that we're doing every now and again, and then send us feedback from there. So we're actually scored on the transcript that we're putting out. They will randomly quality check a transcript and they'll go through. And even though I'm not certain that we would lose points for things like leaving in the and at the start of every single question for Q&A, as I understand it, their preference is to have a transcript that is clean in that respect. But again, if you think it's going to change the meaning, please just leave it in. Better safe than sorry. Because we have to remember that accuracy when it comes to particularly witness evidence is really, really important. And so when you're starting out, it can actually seem a little counterintuitive. You know, you think, well, Katie's telling me that accuracy is really important when it comes to Q&A, but we also have to balance that with the readability of the transcript and the cleanliness, for want of a better word, of the transcript. And again, this is just something that comes with practice and with getting feedback on your work. And it's something that you kind of have to learn, having regard not only to the VGRS manual, but also to the advice and the feedback that you're given based on the feedback we receive from VGRS. Any questions on that at this stage?
I have one about false starts and the lawyers.
Oh, amazing. Lay it on me. That's a really great area to talk about.
Well, I'm really used to typing sort of every single false start and every stutter. So I know that in some of my corrections, you labelled some of what the lawyer said as a false start. So I'm just wondering, is there like a word count or something where you do include it and don't include it if they change the direction of where they're going?
Yeah, unfortunately, the answer is again, not really a hard and fast rule. So I saw those corrections that Josie made, and it can be hard to understand at first exactly, it seems a little bit, uh, yeah, it's hard to know when and when not. I'll just go through now how I think it's best to approach it. First of all, just to reiterate, although I know you're already on top of this, there's a real difference, of course, between the cleaning up and the editing that we do of counsel, so the barristers and the judge, and typing witness evidence, where, of course, we type everything verbatim, with one little proviso that I'll come to in a second based on some feedback we gave over the last few days. But when we are typing counsel and the judge, we do omit false starts. And so just before I start talking about false starts and counsel in witness evidence, I'll just go over that. So for example, when I'm talking about false starts, I mean things that don't lead anywhere and don't affect the meaning of what is being said, or even direct repetition. So for example, say we were at the point in the trial where, just say we're typing discussion, for example. So this is chit chat between the judge and the lawyers. And Mr. Lawyer says, Mr. Lawyer says, Your Honour, I think that this is a really easy example. We've just got one repetition of I, get rid of the repetition. That's a false start. If we get rid of it, it makes for a cleaner transcript, and it doesn't change the meaning at all. Again, when it comes to repeated words, even something a little bit longer. So, Your Honour, I think that, and then he pauses and he says again, I think that I know the answer. This is another easy example. We're typing discussion, we're typing counsel, so we know that we can get rid of false starts. Getting rid of that exact repetition is not going to affect the meaning at all, so I get rid of it. Sometimes you might have a change of direction in the lawyer's thinking, and so they might have a couple of words and then go into something else. So for example, Your Honour, I know, and then they actually change what they're saying. They say, I think that I know the answer. In this sort of circumstance, I would also omit I know, even though it's not followed by a direct repetition. And the reason for that is it's not going to change the meaning at all. It's just going to make it more readable. So you can see that what follows is I think that I know the answer. So really what's encompassed in this little bit that we're going to get rid of is kind of then encompassed again in what follows. It doesn't make any difference to the meaning of what he's saying because it's so similar. So I'm going to get rid of that as well. Another example of that, say we have the judge say, or Mr. Lawyer say, okay, but, and then he thinks about it and he says, Your Honour, I know the answer. Once again, as you might anticipate, I'm going to get rid of the okay, but. Because even though I suppose you could say that he might have started off by thinking he was going to say something adversarial and then goes on just to say, Your Honour, I know the answer. It's not much of anything. So I'd get rid of it. However, if Mr. Lawyer had said something more substantial, like, for example, okay, but Your Honour should know, and then he changes direction and says, Your Honour, I know the answer. This is quite a lengthy start to a thought, and it's quite substantial as well. I would leave that in personally, even though we do our best to clean up counsel. There's clearly more than a tiny bit of a thought there, and you can see that the words are fairly substantial. So I would leave that in, and of course we can see that we always use the dash when we have a about course, a change of direction that doesn't really fit grammatically. So I would leave that. Likewise, just talking about sometimes at the end of someone speaking in discussion, for example. So say Mr. Lawyer said, okay, but Your Honour should know, Your Honour, I know the answer, so, and then he just trails off. And this happens literally all the time. They'll be like, la, 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 so, and it's, again, kind of just a verbal tick. Unless they are interrupted and then continue on with something that directly follows on from that so, which kind of rarely happens, I personally would leave out the so. Just leave it at that. It's not going anywhere. Just get rid of it. And likewise, every now and again, you'll get a lawyer who has that Australian verbal tick of putting but at the ends of their phrases. I've only seen this once because generally lawyers are a bit plummier. But if you had someone who ended every sentence with a but, just get rid of it. Get rid of it. It is not professional and does not need to be in the transcript, unless that but leads on to something else. So just before I move on to an exception to that rule with counsel, is that vaguely clear to everyone? Have I sort of explained that well enough?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. So we're still talking about counsel and the judge. What happens though when we have lawyers asking questions in witness evidence? It's very slightly different, and I'm going to draw your attention to the section of the manual in a second where this is mentioned. When we have lawyers or the judge asking questions of a witness, if they have a false start that is more than 4 words, we must leave that false start in. So for example, we have a lawyer asking questions of the witness and they say, did you go, and then they change direction and they say, what is your mother's name? What's happened here is clearly they started to ask one question, they thought better of it, oh, sorry, that should be a lowercase, and then they changed to a completely different question. I, as a typist, would come here and I would literally count the words, did you go? We've got 3 words there, I'm going to take it out. But if in there they had, did you go to the, this sounds ridiculous, but it's the case, did you go to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I'm going to leave it in because it's more than 4 words. So sometimes that might seem like a bit of an arbitrary distinction, but that's just the rule that we use. And it's because it's so important to have accurately transcribed witness evidence. I mean, it's important to have accurately transcribed everything, but particularly when it comes to witness evidence, because more or less what we're producing is, I guess, not a legal document, but one that comes close to it because it's what the jury potentially are going to be referring to when they retire at the end of the trial to deliberate and to come up with a verdict. Now, the jury are always directed to use what they hear in court as the actual evidence, but at the end of the day, they're not going to remember everything that's said just from listening. So our transcripts are ultimately given to the jury with the witness evidence. Generally, sometimes it's not, but generally, and they'll be looking at it. And so that's why it's so important to have a really accurate transcript. That's why we type the witness verbatim. That's why we have this more than 4 words and we leave it in rule for the lawyer. You joke. Let me just point you to the section in the manual where that can be found. If I can remember. Sorry, just bear with me for 1 second. Here we go. Okay, so on page 78 of the manual, this is in our beloved section 7 again, you can see that we have a section called unnecessary words and phrases when editing. Now, we've just spoken about the fact that for counsel, false starts during discussion can be deleted, but use discretion as sometimes information contained in the false start is needed to make sense of the continuing text. So again, if it seems like the false start is substantial, and again, it's just a matter of learning how to make these judgment calls, then leave it in. And also if the false start turns out to be important to the meaning of what is said, also leave it in. If it's a direct repetition, don't worry about it unless they are using it to be really emphatic. And you can see that that's clearly the case. So we can see actually, if we come down here, it says repetitive phrases should not be deleted as the repetition can be used to emphasize a point. Now by that, the manual doesn't mean I will do this or I want to go. They don't mean that. What they mean is if you have something like down here in our submission, Your Honour, if I can take you to another point, in our submission, the matter, we don't have to worry about deleting in our submission the second time around or deleting it at the start, because we've had a parenthetical phrase in here, and then to really, nail the point into whoever he's speaking to, the judge, they've repeated in our submission. So don't feel like every time there's a repetition you have to delete it for the sake of the readability of the text and cleaning up counsel. It's really if you have direct repetitions of words that are more stutters or false starts, we don't need to worry about that for counsel. And then in here, just in the middle of this section, you can see during question and answer, i.e. during witness evidence, if you're using that Control-L macro every time someone's in the witness box, if there are more than 4 words spoken by counsel and then they withdraw or rephrase the question, this must be left in. And just on that, if I come back to my Word document, say I had Mr. Lawyer asking a question of a witness. He said, Mr. Witness, did you murder? And then he stops and he pauses and he changes direction and he says, Your Honour, I withdraw that question. We type all of that in, we do not get rid of that false start there. So even though he has withdrawn the question, all that means is that he's not going to go back to asking that question. He's going to go on and ask something else. We transcribe him saying, Your Honour, I withdraw that question, and we leave in whatever it is he said before that. We don't get rid of it. And in fact, if you had something in this circumstance, for example, say Mr. Lawyer said, did you murder? And then he thinks about it and he says, Your Honour, I withdraw that question. We can see here that this false start only has 3 words. So if we were strictly to apply what it says in the manual, we think, well, we've got 3 words, that's under 4, so maybe we should omit it. No, let's definitely not do that. First of all, because it's really important to what follows in terms of the meaning. So if we get rid of this and we just start Mr. Lawyer off by saying, Your Honour, I withdraw that question, what's he talking about? Is he talking about the question that he asked previously? We don't know. So as typists, we have to be really aware of whether or not what we are getting rid of is going to affect the overall meaning of the transcript. So if they say anything at all and then immediately afterwards say, Your Honour, I withdraw that question, for the sake of understanding what's going on, we need to leave it in, even if it's below 4 words. And I'll just see if I can find that bit in the manual for you as well, in terms of withdrawing questions. In 1 second. Okay, for some reason my computer isn't really helping me out today. Oh, here we go. Question withdrawn, here we go. So on page 109 at 7.172, we can see there's a little section called question withdrawn. When counsel commences a question, so this is Q&A, and then withdraws it, if there are more than 4 words spoken, this must be left in, as the information contained in the withdrawn question is sometimes needed to make sense of the continuing text. So we can see here Mr. Lawsuit saying, you were just saying that she was, and he thinks better of it and he says, I'll withdraw that. We're obviously going to leave that in. It's exactly like the example that we've just been discussing.
Yeah. That says just there if there are more than 4 words, but you just said even if there are less.
Yes, I did say that, and thank you for picking me up on that. Yes, in here it says if there are more than 4 words spoken, this must be left in. That being said, though, what we were just talking about in terms of context in the text and making the transcript able to be understood, if we have someone withdrawing something and we get rid of what they were withdrawing, well, we still have to type the "I'll withdraw that." So it's going to be very confusing for the person reading the transcript if we get rid of the little false start that they then subsequently withdraw. So you can imagine if we come down. There you go. And this is another point I should say as well, where the manual is a little bit ambiguous, because you're exactly right. If you were to read it there exactly as it says, you'd read, okay, when they commence a question and then withdraw it, but only if there are more than 4 words spoken, then you have to leave it in. But clearly, if we just had here, say for example, above, Mr. Lawyer had asked a question, did you go to the park that day? And the witness says no, and then I'll get rid of this in the margin because it's the same person speaking, and then comes down here and says, did you murder? And then says, Your Honour, I withdraw that question, and we get rid of did you murder and just leave Your Honour, I withdraw that question, then the person reading the transcript is going to say, do they mean they withdraw the question about the park? You see what I mean there? That sometimes even if it's fewer than 4 words, which is what's specified in the manual, if you get rid of that false start and you have the withdrawal of a question, it's going to be ambiguous as to exactly what they're talking about. Does that make sense to everybody, that distinction?
Yes.
Perfect, amazing. So again, I think you'll find once you start typing stuff like that, it'll come to you quite quickly as to where context is needed to make sense of it in the text and where it isn't. It's just a matter of practice, I think. Perfect. So that is that. Just another thing on Q&A. Now, we mentioned when we were talking about exhibits the other day that every time we have an exhibit tendered and we use the macro, we would then paste what we have in our Word document into the glossary. So, for example, say in here, Mr. Lawyer has been asking these questions, and then he says, Your Honour, I want to tender this knife, this bloody knife, as an exhibit. And then His Honour says, no worries, the bloody knife will be exhibit A. We, of course, would come to our VGRS ribbon, come over here, click on exhibits. We're going to chuck in exhibit A, and then the description, bloody knife, and a full stop at the end. We always have to remember that full stop at the end of the description for exhibits. There we go. Now, we haven't had any date for this because you can't date a bloody knife. And just for I don't know if you guys have ever come across anything like this in exhibits, but I personally have never seen a knife exhibited to the court. So I live in hope. What we would then do at this point as typists is just highlight and copy that. And again, you can highlight the whole macro if you want, but because I'm a bit of a glossary Nazi, I like to keep it really neat. So I generally will start at that hash just before the exhibit. It really doesn't matter. Then I will come over to my matter. So just in our training tab, say again, it's our old favourite, the case of DPP against Georgina Matter and Robin Taylor. I jump into my glossary and I would scroll down to the section on exhibits. Now, you may remember for this one, the exhibits are at the end of the glossary because there were so many of them, but usually it's up here at the start. I'll come all the way down, and as you can see has been done here, I would literally just say there weren't any just yet. I would paste that in, and you might remember as well, ideally, we follow it with the day that you're typing. So say it's day 1 of a trial, you would type the cut, so say it's cut D, and then I would put in my initials so everybody knows when that exhibit was exhibited or was tendered. So we can see it was on day 1 in cut D sometime, and who it was that had it in their cut, just for accountability purposes. That was me. Now, we do exactly the same thing when it comes to the phases of witness evidence. And this is something I briefly touched on, I think, the other day, but I just wanted to make that really clear because obviously it's something you probably haven't had the opportunity to practice yet, but will become really important when you start typing particularly on running matters, so matters that are happening on the day, and we're doing a transcript to be returned to the parties on that day. So you can see here in the glossary, just above where we would usually have the exhibits, we've also done exactly the same thing for all the phases of witness evidence. So you can see it's been segmented into day 1, day 3. Probably that means that on day 2, our stenographers did the transcript, so it wasn't done by typists. Day 4, etc., etc. And for each day, you can see that for every new phase of evidence for each witness, we have the macro that has been used. Now you might ask, well, why bother putting that in the glossary? What's the point? The point is that as typists, it's a really, really useful resource for us, because sometimes we might not be so lucky as to have, for example, a log. So usually when we're typing county or supreme matters, we almost always have a log that's been prepared by the monitors, and you'll remember that shows us more or less what's been happening at what time, who's been speaking, when there's been a new witness, all of that. But sometimes you might be typing a matter that for whatever reason doesn't have a log. Now, if I'm a typist that is starting a matter like that without no log, say on day 3, halfway through the day, halfway through someone's evidence, and I don't have a log to check to see what's going on and to check and see what phase of evidence we might be up to, I'm going to have no earthly idea what macros I should be using at what point. Say I come into a cut and it's halfway through the cross-examination. It's good for me to be able to know that what I'm typing is cross-examination, because then when I come to the end of it, if the next lawyer gets up and starts asking their questions, I know that I'm going to need to use the re-examination macro at this point, because we've finished the cross-examination, we're on to the logical next phase. Now, every now and again, the lawyers or the judge will give you the prompt, so you could figure it out for yourself. So we might come, for example, to the end of the cross-examination that I didn't know was cross-examination, and the judge will say, "Mr. Lawyer, any re-examination?" And of course, obviously, that's going to be your indicator that that's the phase of examination we're moving into. But it is so much easier for us as typists if we can simply just jump into the glossary and we can see that, oh, the last phase, for example, if I come down here, where's a good example? Say I was coming in after this person, we can see, okay, well, we're up to Sheens, the witness Sheens, so that's his surname that's been put out the front. We can see that on day 4 in cut II, they started the cross-examination of Sheens. So if I'm at cut JJ, for example, I know that it's going to be re-examination at this point. So when we copy that macro over, sometimes it doesn't copy over the surname. So at that point, I would put the surname in and I'd group it with the appropriate witness, because you can see here that that's what's been done. We've had one witness, Morris Solomon Odell, who has then gone through various phases of examination, and we can see that because it's Odell, 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 and we can see that that probably all happened on day 4. Then we've had another witness in here, Bunius, who by the looks of things only had one phase of examination and disappeared, or potentially the typists have forgotten to put it in. Then we can see we came down here and we actually had a voir dire. So that means that the witness Sheens gave his evidence in the absence of the jury. And because it is a voir dire, let me just remind myself of the distinction. I think it's the voir dire that happens after a jury has been impaneled, but in the absence of the jury. So it's usually if, to be honest, the judge or the lawyers are afraid of what the witness is going to say. So for example, you might have a bit of a bonkers witness, or you might have a witness that is overtly hostile, or you might have a witness that can't necessarily be trusted not to say things that will then unfairly prejudice the accused person in the eyes of the jury. So what they'll do is they'll say, okay, well, we want to hear what this person is going to say. We want to hear their evidence. So we're going to bring them into court, but we're going to send the jury out. So the jury won't hear this witness evidence, only the judge and the lawyers will. And then if they think it's going to be all right, potentially they'll bring the jury back in and they'll do the whole thing again in front of the jury. So I just explained that to show you that that's what's happened here. Someone's put in that there's been a voir dire for this particular witness. And usually I would also put in the glossary when the voir dire ends. So say after witness Sheens, we went on to witness Walsh, and witness Walsh was in front of the jury, I would put at the end of Sheens, end voir dire. Again, these are little things, so don't stress too much if you can't remember, but it is very important to put the witness event macros in here. So just as an example, jumping back into my Word document, say then His Honour says, we will now hear from the witness Bloggs, and then he says, Mr. Prosecutor, and by that he means Mr. Prosecutor, start your examination. There we go. So we know this is the first time that we're seeing witness Bloggs. So we know he's going to be sworn in or affirmed, and we're from there going to start the first phase of examination, the examination in chief. So I'm going to jump up to my VGRS ribbon. I'm going to come across to witness events. Just as we've spoken about, say, for example, this time witness Joe Bloggs decides that he wants to take an affirmation. So I'm going to click affirmed and examined. So we know that within that macro, we have the affirmation included and we have more or less the notation for the first phase of examination. I'm going to come down here, Joe Anthony Bloggs, surname in the witness abbreviated name, okay. And there's our macro. And we're ready to go after that with Mr. Lawyer, who's going to ask some questions. And just as a reminder, we've put Mr. Lawyer's name in the margin because in the affirmed and examined macro, the lawyer's name is not mentioned. If though, for example, we had cross-examination macro, we do put the barrister's name in, so say Mr. Defence. Just as a reminder, after that, there's no need to put the defence lawyer's name in the margin. We would just go straight into the, but did you kill them? Coming back up to our first macro, say this was in our cut, we've popped the macro in, they're starting the Q&A, we would come up here and just as we've described, copy this, bring it over, say we're on day one, say this is the very first witness of the trial. We're going to come up here, we're going to chuck it in, and then sometimes the formatting is a bit weird, so if you're a little bit intense about the glossary like I am, you can waste your time like I do by fixing it up and coming into format, spacing it to single spacing. And then I usually put just a little space in here so we can really clearly see that it's witness Bloggs at the start. And likewise, then, for example, say we had our cross-examination a little bit later on and it was still in your cut and we popped in the lawyer's name. Again, we would copy that, we would come on over, and you can see for this one, witness name actually doesn't come up in the macro. So it is just a matter of ideally popping in Bloggs at the start so everybody can see there that it's witness Bloggs. And of course, because I am an excellent typist, I would pop in the day, the cut, my initials for both of those. 1F, for example. So again, a very simple point, but one that is really important, mostly for us as typists. But something else to keep in mind is that this actually hasn't been relevant for me yet, but I do believe that when as typists down the line, our work is quality checked by EPIC, I do believe that they take into account how assiduous we are with filling out the glossary. So again, we don't want to spend too much of our time putting every single thing ever into the glossary if it's not needed, but things like, for example, witness events, exhibits, authorities, important names, these are all things that I do believe CAT and the TCs would look at in terms of our work when they're quality checking the sort of stuff that we're doing. So it's worthwhile not only for your own sake, but for, or rather not only for the sake of other typists, but also for your own sake. Any questions on using the glossary in that way when we've got witness evidence? No, all pretty straightforward. No worries at all. Fantastic. Okie doke. Beautiful. So those are the things that I wanted to mention this morning. Thank you so much for bearing with me until 11:30 on that feedback, but I think it was worthwhile. Now, what I would like to do just really quickly is just do a very brief recap of the things that we've talked about in the VGRS Word Macros ribbon. And I really won't take very much time with this because it's really only to make sure that we can see that we've gone through everything that's there. We know in what circumstances we use it, and then we can contrast this ribbon with the civil ribbon that we're going to look at in a second. So literally just going across the page, I'm going to highlight to you the ones that aren't important to us as typists, but just so you know where they are and vaguely what they are. First of all, we've got the About macro just over the very left-hand side of the ribbon, and you can see it gives us some shortcuts there. Some of them are useful for us, and we've spoken about them before. For example, the Control L for Q&A. Some of them in here are really more important for the TCs, so the Alt-M, for example, for the merge files. And then the other ones in there, if you would like to use those shortcuts, if you don't already have particular shortcuts you're using, feel free. It's something that I haven't quite graduated to yet, but I'm sure it would speed up your typing. So that's that little icon. We don't need to worry about the import icon here. It's my understanding that the TCs use that in the merge, not important for us as a typist. The document tab, as we've spoken about, the start document is really important because as you would have practiced, that's how we input our footer for criminal matters. And you might remember as well that we briefly mentioned the insert copyright the other day. That is for the first cut of the day on the first day of a new matter. But apart from that, we don't need to insert the copyright for any subsequent days or cuts. So just for that first cut on the first day of the matter. Beautiful. Now the other little ones in here I have never had to use personally. You can see there's something in here about like the Court of Appeal. The order to record sometimes is used in the Magistrates Court, but don't worry about that just yet. That's just to let you know what it is. Really for our purposes, particularly in typing county and Supreme Courts, in criminal, we're just looking at the start document for the footer under that little icon. Now, we discussed the arraignment macro yesterday. So I'll just remind you, if we are at the start of a criminal trial and we've got to the point where the accused person is formally arraigned, that is, formally presented with the charges against him, usually read out by the judge's associate, and then enters a formal plea of guilty or not guilty, that is what we refer to as the arraignment. It's just got a little box to put in the accused's name. It's got boxes for the charges that he's charged with. And if we have more than one of the same charge, we can specify how many in here. And if it's more than 10 charges for one particular thing, we can also just put in, for example, 10 charges. And then when we generate the macro, we can manually change it to 15 or something. I never thought that would happen. And then I typed on a truly horrendous case about a fake gynecologist earlier this year. It was horrendous. And he actually did have more than 10 charges for one particular charge. So it does happen. And we'll just remember down here, this is where we can elect whether or not we have guilty or not guilty. We can do not guilty to all charges, guilty to all if we want. And then just really briefly, if you wanted to add another accused person or even more, you can do the same by just pressing this button down here. And that's if we have multiple arraignments happening at the same time. If they're doing, for example, one trial for 3 or 4 different people, they will arraign them all generally at the same time. That happens fairly rarely though, as you might imagine. So that's the arraignment icon and the arraignment macro. Then of course we move over to adjournments, and we've already spoken about that at fair length, so I won't linger on it, but you'll remember that every time we have an adjournment, that is every time the court stops and they go away for a coffee or they go away for lunch or they finish up for the day, we need to represent that in the transcript by using an adjournment macro. So you'll remember for short or temporary adjournments, so usually there's at least one in the morning session of a criminal case, and there's usually at least one in the afternoon, unless you have the judge that I typed earlier this year who told the lawyers that he thought it was a waste of time and he didn't want to baby the jury and then they get no breaks. But generally it'll be like 10, 15 minutes. Sometimes it may be longer. We would click the short adjournment macro. Every day there's a lunch adjournment from maybe 1 to 2 or 1:30 to 2:15. That's when we would use that macro. We also have a macro for resuming in the afternoon after the lunch break. So we only use this when the court comes back after lunch for the afternoon session. And as you can see, it prompts you to give the time that they came back from lunch and the judge's name and whether or not it's his or her honour. At the end of the day, of course, we also need an adjournment macro, and we've got two options generally. So in terms of the macro, we can have adjourned to a date to be fixed. So that means, well, we're adjourning for the day, but we might come back tomorrow, we might come back in 2 days, we might come back in 2 weeks. We don't know yet. And when we use that one, it comes up as adjourned to a date to be fixed. But we might remember as well, we discussed that is often referred to in these matters as adjourned sine die. Horrible pronunciation of the Latin. It just means without, the sine, and the die means a day. So without a day, i.e. adjourned a date to be fixed. And then the other option is adjourned until. So say we're finishing up for the day and we know it's coming back tomorrow, well, we're going to jump into adjourned until and we're going to put in tomorrow's date. And then this one down here we haven't really spoken about. It's all evidence concluded, and it looks like this. All evidence concluded. This is only used for the Magistrates Court, and I'm very briefly going to touch on it after lunch. But again, if we're typing for the Supreme or the County, we never need to worry about that. So we've spoken about all of those adjournments there. Of course, the only other way that we might finish off the transcript for the day, to say they're finishing up for the day, they're all going to go home to their families, whatever. Instead of adjourned for a date to be fixed or adjourned until, every now and again, the matter actually might be just done. They might be finished. Maybe they're at the end of the trial. Maybe they've just had the sentence or a ruling or a judgment. You might remember from yesterday's discussion that if the case is fully done, and it'll usually be at the end of a sentence or a ruling or a judgment, or a sentence or a judgment generally, we will finish it off with the 3 dashes. And I believe I pointed you to the page in the manual that you can have a look at that yesterday, but I think it's just referred to as 3 dashes in the manual, so you can search for it. Alrighty. Beautiful. So that's all of the adjournment macro. Court events. You'll remember that we've spoken in detail about some of these, but some of them might still seem a bit mysterious to you. The start in camera and end in camera, of course, you're familiar with that one. That's when we have a closed court. So it might be a child witness giving evidence. It might be an adult witness giving evidence about a sexual matter, for example. The material is sensitive, so His Honour orders the court to be closed. Every single person leaves in there except for the judge, the lawyers, the witness, potentially the police informant, and they do it all in the privacy of the courtroom, and then they open it up after that witness's evidence. So you'll remember that's what those macros there are for. The start and end charge, we haven't really spoken about in detail, but you might remember from our flowchart about the procedure for criminal trials that at the very end, after all the evidence has been given, the judge will give a special pre-prepared speech to the jury about the importance of what they're about to deliberate on. So they'll say, the judge will say, okay, you're going to go away and think about what your verdict is going to be, whether you find the accused guilty or not guilty. This is important, la, 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 la. We would use the start charge and end charge macros for that. Again, I have never had to type that because, as we were saying yesterday, those final phases of a criminal trial, generally in the county court at least, are only transcribed by request. So if you ever have a charge start to be given in your cut, I would go to section 6 of the manual to make sure that you're supposed to be typing it for the particular court that you're in. And I would also check with the TC as to whether or not it has been requested. But I think you'll find that you very rarely even get to that point in your typing, to be honest. We spoke about start and end ruling macros yesterday. Obviously, that's when there's a ruling given in court, but you might also remember that we use start and end ruling for judgments as well. We just manually change it. So say Judge Patrick, pretty sure it's His Honour, was giving a ruling, we would use this macro, but we would use exactly the same one for judgments. I just come in here and type in judgment. And just as a little by the by, just remember that VGRS likes us to spell judgment without the E after the G. So if you look it up in the dictionary, an Australian dictionary, it's acceptable, say in the Macquarie dictionary, to spell judgment either with J-U-D-G-E-M-E-N-T or without that extra E. VGRS wants us to spell it without. And we come down here and we change ruling to judgment, and I just put those little spaces in to make sure it was exactly the same. And then we're ready to go. And likewise, at the end of that ruling, we would use the end ruling macro and we change the word ruling to judgment. That's that macro. Start and end redirection. Again, that is for the end of a criminal trial, and generally you won't get to that point. But if you wanted, you could have a look again at our criminal trial procedure flowchart and see that it generally happens after the charge has been given by the judge. If the lawyers don't really agree with what the judge was saying and they want him to redirect the jury officially, then we would use this start redirection macro, Judge Patrick, His Honour, and it looks like this. And then there's one to end it as well. Beautiful. But redirection throughout the trial, we don't need to worry about using the macro. They'll sometimes use the word redirection to give the jury instructions, but we only use the macro for that official phase called redirection that occurs at the very end of a trial before the jury delivers their verdict. So again, good to be aware of. Don't necessarily need to know the ins and outs right now. Likewise, if there's an official finding commenced, we have a macro for that. You can read about that more in the manual. I've never had to use it. Address we've spoken about fairly in detail. So you might remember that for the county court criminal matters, we do not type opening and closing addresses. We use an inner margin notation instead. County court criminal matters, we do not type the addresses. If you have a look in the manual at the Supreme Court, it does say, there's actually some ambiguity in there, but it does say in the particular section on opening addresses that it's transcribed in the Supreme Court. But again, to be honest, I haven't had many Supreme Court criminal matters that I've had to type on. But if you were typing it out in full, say it was in the Supreme Court, you knew that you had to type it out, or say it was a civil matter, we could use the start address typed in full macro, pop in the barrister's name, and then at the end we'd use end address. So that's that for opening and closing addresses. That is the official speech that the lawyers give at the start and the end of the case, that at the one point describes what the case is going to be about, and at the end really nails in their argument and explains to the jury why you should find the accused person guilty or not guilty. That's what we're referring to by addresses. We also have a macro for start plea and end plea. Now again, I have not personally as a typist had to type a plea. You might remember yesterday we very briefly mentioned that if we have a criminal matter and the accused is arraigned and they plead guilty to everything, well, we know at this point there's not going to be a trial because there's nothing for a jury to decide. They've pled guilty, they're going to be sentenced. That's all there is to it. And at that point, we don't type anymore. So after the arraignment of not guilty, we would literally just pop in the inner margin notation. I think it's at this stage, the matter proceeded to a plea. And we would let the TC know that it proceeded to a plea and our job is done. If though we for some reason got an order to do a plea, or if we were told for this particular matter that they wanted it typed, then that is where we would come for that macro into the court events. We've already spoken about the voir dire, and we've described how it's when we have witness evidence in the absence of the jury. There is a macro for that. You might remember as well that we briefly discussed Basher hearings. Basher hearings are very, very similar to voir dires. It's also witness evidence given in the absence of the jury. But if I've got the distinction right, it's because Bashers happen before there is even a jury. So say you have a criminal trial and you haven't impaneled a jury yet because it's still very early, maybe you've just had legal discussion up to this point. If they know that there's going to be a tricky or a risky witness, a lot of the time what they'll do is they'll get the witness to come in before they have even impaneled a jury to have a Basher hearing in which they listen to the evidence and they see whether or not they're going to call this witness when the jury has been impaneled. You'll see there's no macro for Bashers, and that's just how it is. No macro for Bashers. We just understand it's a Basher from context in the transcript, but there are macros for start and end voir dire. However, when we have start and end voir dire, just keep in mind what we described the other day. That is something that personally, if it started or finished in my cut, I would be making a note of on the spreadsheet in the notes section. For example, voir dire begins cut D. And then later somebody else might have had the end of the voir dire and they would say voir dire finishes cut HH. And I would do exactly the same for a Basher, just so all the typists know what's going on in the matter, especially if they can't see it from the logs. And also it means that when the TCs come to merge the matter, they can come in here and look at the notes section and immediately see that they should be looking out for a voir dire when they're doing the merge. Because as you can imagine, every now and again, maybe the typist who starts the voir dire will put in the macro, and then the typist who finishes the voir dire will forget to put it in. It's really good for the TCs to have a bit of an idea when they look at the spreadsheet that that's something they're going to have to be double checking when they do the merge. Oh, excuse me. Coming back to our document. Then we have start exception and end exception. This is again, talking about the very end of a criminal trial. I have also never had to use these macros because generally we don't get this far in our typing. But we were talking about before the judge's charge to the jury about the importance of the task. Then the fact that sometimes the lawyers will disagree. And you might have the judge give a very specific direction to them. I think that's what we're referring to about when we talk about exceptions, but I'll just point you to the section in the manual to have a look if you're interested. Again, as it's something that I haven't done, it's not something that I'm incredibly familiar with. Exception. Here we go. Alrighty, so it's on page 79, 7.87 exceptions, if you're interested in having a look there. But in any case, that's what that macro is for. So now we've spoken about all of our court events macros. So I'm going to move on to just remind us about the exhibits macro. We've already spoken about that this morning, no need to linger. We chuck in a code for the exhibit, we chuck in the description, always finished by a full stop, and making sure that if we have a date, it's in the correct day, month, year format with the full stop at the end. And of course, after we've done that exhibit, we would copy paste it into the glossary to make sure that everyone knows about it. Jury events over here is something that we spent a fair amount of time on yesterday, so I won't linger, but we have jury in, jury out, so that's when they're coming into the courtroom and leaving. We have in the absence of the jury, so you might remember this is the one that we use every time we have a short adjournment, and then we come back into the court and the jury haven't been brought in yet. We'll use in the absence of the jury. After, at the very start of each new day with the jury, however, we use upon resuming in the absence of the jury. So that's just for the very start of the day. And then jury question, we only use that macro for jury questions at the very end of the trial during that deliberation process. We can have random questions to the jury throughout the trial, and that's fine. We don't need to use a macro. Again, this refers to that official phase at the very end of the trial. Witness events we've spoken about in length, so I won't go into it again, but we have all of our phases of examination in here. Really good to just remember that distinction between withdrew and excused. They withdraw if they haven't been given the official "you're completely done" speech by the judge. Okay. We have our little icon up here for interpreter, which I forgot about the other day. When we're swearing in or affirming an interpreter, we just click the appropriate box and then we chuck their name in. Okay. And then these ones over here, insert CMP, find CMP format, I do not use as a typist, and I think they're of more use to the mergers than they are to us. There we go. Also find recalled for the mergers, and finalise document. The TCs use that when they're merging criminal matters. So I just wanted to go through all of that again to make sure that you knew what was there and vaguely what it was all about. Does anyone have any questions on that before I move on to talking about civil? No, all fairly straightforward. And of course, things we've spoken about before, but I think reiteration never hurts. Okie doke. So now I do note that the time is 10 to 12. Let me just have a look and remind myself. I hope that my little discussion on civil and the civil macros will hopefully only go for 15 to 20 minutes at the most, because then I'd really like to give you at least 20 minutes before lunch to start maybe having a bit of a type of that first segment of audio that I directed you to in the email. So rest assured, hopefully I won't talk for very much longer. So now that we've really recapped a lot of what is involved in criminal matters, I'd like to just briefly introduce civil matters to you. Now, it's something that we haven't really touched on a lot this week, and you might remember that that is because there is no civil manual for typists. This was something I was confused about when I started as a typist, but just remember, as we clarified on the first day of training, the VGRS manual is a criminal manual, because of course the Victorian Government Reporting Service is only in charge of reporting matters that are prosecuted on behalf of the state. They're a government organisation. When we come to civil matters, generally the parties approach us directly. So that's why the VGRS manual is purely a criminal manual. There is no manual for civil. So how do we know how to type civil matters? Well, we know because we adapt the criminal manual given to us by VGRS. So a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about this week is directly applicable to civil, so you don't have to worry about learning this whole completely new thing. It only differs in a very few ways. But just on a very 101 for a second, what actually is a civil matter? If you are like me, and I remember that a couple of you might have mentioned that you might be relatively new to the legal world in terms of typing. When I started, I had absolutely no idea even really the distinction between criminal and civil matters. So just very briefly, I actually got the definition from the Justice website. But civil law defines the rights and responsibilities of individuals, government entities, and private or non-government organisations in their interactions with each other. So there's the distinction there. As we've been speaking about, in a criminal matter, the state prosecutes the person who is alleged to have committed an offence. Because what's happened in that case is someone has broken a law, potentially committed a crime, and it's understood as a crime against the community. That's why it's a crime. But in civil matters, it concerns interactions between private entities or individuals. And so what that means is that there is generally a wrong that has been committed by one private entity or individual against another private entity or individual. And when I say private, sorry, I'm including government in that as well. And so as you might know already, or as you might imagine, when we're talking about criminal matters, generally what will happen is that if somebody is found guilty, they will have a sanction imposed upon them. So when I talk about sanctions, I might mean that they go to prison or they have to pay a very large fine. But usually it's prison time, as we would know, or it might be something else like a community-based order or a supervision order or something like that. That's a sanction. But when we're talking about civil matters, because it's between two individuals or two entities, usually what we're looking at is parties going for damages. So usually it's about a sort of monetary reward or monetary granting of damages at the end. So that's what civil matters are. Now, we do a lot of civil matters at EPIC, but just to give you some idea, going forward, we will mostly be doing civil matters in the county court, in the magistrates court, at VCAT, and then we generally use civil procedures, I suppose, for private matters as well. So every now and again, we might record a meeting for some organisation and we'll type it more or less as we would for civil. You might have noticed that I left out the Supreme Court in that list. In the past, we have done a lot of civil matters for the Supreme Court, but that is going to change, as I understand it, throughout the rest of this year and going forward. So mostly what we'll be typing in the future for the Supreme Court will be criminal matters. So as you're starting out as typists, the civil typing that you'll be doing will mostly be county and potentially magistrates. Now, as just going back to basics, as we've been talking about definitions, I'll just remind you that for those of you who aren't necessarily familiar with what cases or matter names look like, we've already spoken a number of times this week that we can tell if something is criminal by looking at the matter name. So I'm back on my transcript schedule now, and for this particular matter, I can see that it's the Director of Public Prosecutions against Georgina Matter, etc. We know that the DPP, or the R for King or Queen, Regina or Rex, means that it's a criminal matter. Just a little reminder, if we come further down the list to the example that I sent you in an email, down here we have Paul Bannon and Nauru Phosphate Royalties Trust. We have two individuals or entities on either side of the V, which we usually say as and. We know it's going to be a civil matter. There's lots of examples of this usually in the backlog. There we go. We've got, that's all VCAT, but we can see down here a county court matter. We've got two individuals or private entities on either side of the V. So Stephen John Chester and H.H. Webb and Co. Pty Ltd. We know it's going to be civil. So it's just good to have your head around that so you know what you're dealing with when you're typing something and whether or not you're going to be following criminal or civil conventions. Joke. Beautiful. So what I'm going to do, just to get us used to the things that are involved in civil and the main differences to criminal, is that I'm going to take us through the transcript ribbon in Microsoft Word, because most of the things that we come across in there are the things that you need to be aware of when typing civil. Now, as I've said before, when we are typing civil matters, we basically adapt the VGRS manual. So if we can follow what is in the VGRS manual for criminal matters, and here I'm talking mostly about style, about formatting, and about general concepts, then we will just do exactly the same for civil. But there are a few differences in there. Now, the first difference for us, of course, is when we are setting up our cut in a civil matter, we use a different footer. And you're probably already aware of this because we briefly mentioned it on day one, and it's also included in the handout that I sent to you about how to set up footers. For a civil matter, we would come to the transcript ribbon and we would come over here to footer setup. And it comes up with a little box just like we would for criminal, but it's a bit longer in terms of the things that we have to put in. So you can see all of these input areas, and I'll just briefly run over them with you. Say I have matter open again. I would have my spreadsheet up so I can see all of the information there. And I would come up to my first box in Microsoft Word in footers, and I would see that I need to put in the turn, and I need to put it in this format over here. You can see they've given us the example of T1A. Now you'll remember that turn is just the same word as cut. So say I came, oh, this is a criminal matter actually. Sorry, I'll get into that other one that we're going to be looking at in a little bit. Here we go. So this is Bannon, the matter of Bannon. Now say I wanted to type cut D here. I've popped my initials in. Oh, excuse me. Okay, so I know that it's cut D, and I know that it's day 9. I come back here and I put in T for turn. I put in 9 for day 9, and I put in D for turn or cut D. And I move down to initials, and you can see they've given this example of how we need to do it. Dot, initials, colon, initials. So I'm going to put in a dot. I'm going to follow it up with the initials of the monitor. So we can see in this civil matter, the monitor on the spreadsheet is NB, who's one of our newer monitors, and whose name actually escapes me, embarrassingly, but dot NB, and then I'm going to put a colon, and then the initials that follow are my own initials, so I'm going to put KLM. Then we need the case date, so I'm going to look back on my spreadsheet, and I see that this occurred on the 14th of the 5th, 18. So I'm going to put in 14/05/18. Oh, what am I doing? Sorry, I'm putting that in the matter name. Put that in the case date. You can see they've shown us the format it needs to be in. I'm going to follow it with the case name. And you can see in our matter that we always go to case footer name and put exactly whatever's in there into the footer. So this case is just being called Bannon. We don't need to worry about the entire long matter name over here in the right-hand corner. We just go to case footer name because we're doing the footers, and we're going to go Bannon. And then the last thing we need to input for the civil footer is the TOMS number, also known as the EPIC number. And this is the one point where we need to ignore the example that they've given us, because our EPIC numbers are formatted slightly different. And you might remember from day 1, if we come to our spreadsheet and come right up the top, the EPIC number looks like this. Got 2 numerals, a dash, and then 4 numerals. And for this particular one, it's 18-0442. I'm going to chuck that in. Now, if I, for some reason, didn't have it up the top of my spreadsheet, you should also be able to find the EPIC number on the transcript schedule. So if I come up here, I can see that I've got EPIC number, scroll down. For the case of Bannon, it's down here, 18-0442. Oops. So I'm going to press OK. And we can see this is what our civil footer looks like. So unlike the criminal, which is just 1 line, we can see that for the civil footer, we have 3 lines with all of that information in there. And then we're ready to start our type. At this point, we would save the document just like we would for criminal, and we save civil matters using exactly the same conventions as we do for criminal. You'll be happy to know. So again, it would just be a matter of, if I was saving this, seeing what the save as is. It's the first 4 letters of Bannon, so it would be BANN, day 9, so the numeral 9, followed by the particular cut D, ban 9D, if I was saving this. And then I'd be ready to go. I just set up my autocorrects as usual. That's all the same for civil. Perfect. And so now I'll take us through the rest of the macros in here. Over here we have make stickies, remove stickies, and witness exhibit list on the far left of the transcript ribbon. Again, these are for our transcript coordinators when they're doing the merge. I've never had to use them as a typist. We've just gone through the footer setup for civil. We've also briefly spoken about fixed formats. I think that was yesterday. I did that a number of times this morning, as you probably got sick of having to watch. When you lose the indent, when you're typing lengthy responses, for example, it's just a matter of highlighting what you need to change back to the correct formatting and clicking Fix Format. Fix Exhibit Format is something that our transcript coordinators use. Don't worry about it. End of tape, of course, you're all very familiar with by this stage, because it's this one that we have to use that prompts the spell check at the end of every single cut, and that's exactly the same for civil. So at the start of each civil cut, we do the footer slightly differently, but at the end of every civil cut, we just use the end of tape, just as we would for a criminal matter. Now we come over here to our trial macros. Now, many of them don't need much more explanation because we've already gone over them in the criminal, but we can see here, if you hover your mouse over these various icons, the little lock icon is the start in camera for civil. So just as the same as if it were a criminal procedure, we would come in here and use this start in camera macro, and we would finish with end in camera. And that's just our closed court macro, obviously. We come down to the little discussion icon. Now, if I click on that, you can see it comes up with discussion. We don't use that as typists. So this is something that I double checked last night with TC Josie. When they are doing the merge, there is no reason for us to have used macros to indicate when there's discussion between the judge and the lawyers, because in the process of merging, that is automatically generated. So please don't worry about that little icon that says discussion, the little way thingy, the scales, sorry, in English. We don't need to use that. If we continue to the little torso icon, this is the begin address macro. So I'm going to click on that. You can see it's pretty much the same sort of thing as it was for criminal, but we will put in the barrister name as well, Mr. Lawyer, into that. And we would start typing from that point. And this is a good prompt just to remind you, for civil matters, we do type the opening and closing addresses. And in fact, at this point, it's good to mention, for civil matters, we pretty much type everything. So unless you were specifically told not to type something, or unless, for example, it's something like one of the lawyers is making lengthy submissions, that is making a lengthy legal argument to the judge, and he's quoting pages and pages of legislation, you might remember that we don't necessarily have to type all of that. We could just do quote first 3 words, whatever the first 3 words may be, ... reads ... and you'll note, and then, oops, last 3 words. And you'll note there that I didn't let the ... auto correct to the squished up dots together. It does have to look like this because this is what it looks like in the manual. So that's a case where in civil you might not type absolutely everything, but pretty much for everything else you do type it. The impanelment, the jury impanelment, you would still use the same notation as we've spoken about before, but things like addresses, we're going to type all of that. Obviously, the witness Q&A, we're going to type all of that. Closing submissions, we're going to type that. It's just probably more typing than we would necessarily do in criminal. So that's the start address icon there. Now, technically, we could also use this for, if we come back to our criminal court events, you might remember that we did actually have a start address macro for criminal as well. And you may be thinking, well, if we never type the opening and closing addresses in criminal in the county court unless it's requested, then why do we have a start address typed in full macro? And that's because every now and again in criminal matters, you will have somebody who does not have legal representation, and we refer to these people as self-represented. It usually happens in civil, though. It's usually a civil thing, but I think it can also happen in criminal, so that's why that's in there. If you ever have someone who is self-represented, whether or not in criminal or civil, you will type more or less everything in terms of opening addresses, in terms of witness Q&A, and that's because they don't have the benefit of a lawyer, and so the transcript needs to be more comprehensive for their purposes. Alrighty, so that's the address. We do generally type opening and closing addresses for civil. The first big difference between that and criminal we need to remember. Just moving quickly on, we have this little macro with a couple of little squares in it and a sort of torso in one. I'm going to pop, that's the was heard to address, so I'm going to put in Mr. Lawyer. And you can see Mr. Lawyer was heard to address the jury. That's if for some reason we weren't typing opening addresses. Just good to keep in mind. Coroner swear-in I've never had to use, and I think you will never have to either, to be honest, but that's what that is and that's how it looks. You would put in sworn or affirmed, the name of the witness and the short name, i.e. their surname. Up here, the two little arrows, that's if a witness is ever ordered out of court, or witnesses are ordered out of court. So sometimes, for example, you might have one witness giving evidence, and then the judge says, okay, I don't want any other witnesses listening to this witness's evidence. So say a mum and a daughter were both giving evidence. Mum's about to get up on the stand and start her Q&A, and the judge might say, I want the daughter to leave court because I don't want the daughter to hear this because I know that she's giving evidence later. So that's what we would use that for. Now we're going to come to the most important point of differentiation, probably for civil, and that's for witness events. Now it's this little hand icon here in the transcript ribbon, and you can see that the witness events macro looks a bit different for civil than it does for criminal. And that's because of this important point. You might remember in criminal that we don't timestamp any witness events. So every time we have a new phase of witness examination, for example, you'll remember that those macros, and I can show you in Taylor, that criminal matter from before, those macros just looked like, whoops, like this. You can see it's the name, cross-examined, or whatever phase of examination by so-and-so. There's no timestamp in there. There's no time that tells us when that examination happened. However, for civil, we must always include a timestamp for every witness event. We must always include when that witness event is taking place. So if they are being sworn, if they are being affirmed, if there is a voir dire, if they are having different phases of examination, so examination in chief, cross-examination, re-examination, any of these down here. If they are being withdrawn, we must put a timestamp in for when that is happening. So say this person was being sworn, witnesses for full name, Joe Anthony Logs, witness short name, Logs. It's going to be the examination in chief because that's the first phase of examination after they've been sworn in. I must put in what time this is starting. So say I have a look in the log, I have a look in my FTR and it's starting at 2:15. I put in 2:15 p.m. And I don't need to put in the barrister's name because it reminds you here, you do not need to put in the barrister's name if it's XN or called or recalled. Now you can see over here, we're having the examination in chief, which is XN. So no need for the barrister's name. I'm going to press OK. And it comes up just like this with the timestamp at the end. Very, very important. Criminal matters, no timestamp for witness events. Civil matters, always a timestamp for witness events. And in fact, this is so important that sometimes the TCs will remind you. They don't give you a reminder in civil matters, but if you come to a criminal matter, like Georgina matter again, you can see that on every criminal worksheet, they will remind us before uploading criminal cuts, please check that there are no timestamps for witness events. So none for criminal, always for civil. Now I'm very aware of the time, so let's see if I can wrap this up quickly. We have also, under the little witness events macro, we have the swearing interpreter. So pretty much exactly the same as it was for criminal, but we're just in civil now. We have a little arrow in a circle. That's if a witness is recalled. So it's very similar to what we had for criminal. It just looks a bit different. And again, we will have the timestamp in there because it's a witness event. Under that, we have witness withdrew. So this has a separate little macro than for all the other witness events in the little hand. So we could go excused, and then we put in the time that that happened. So say 2:15, and this is what it would look like with the timestamp. Now you'll notice in there that it does also give an option for criminal. Don't worry about that, because if we're withdrawing a witness in a criminal matter, we should be using the VGRS word macros ribbon. We have a little camera icon here. That's if a recording is played to the court. So you might remember from the other day, if media is played to the jury as evidence, then we use the one tab in recording played to court annotation, and you can see up here that we can literally go video played to court and it immediately does that for us. We have a little pin. This is the exhibits for civil. Again, exactly the same as it is in criminal, and you just follow the prompts. The only difference is you can be a bit lazier in civil, and if you have something that's tendered, say, as part of a voir dire, and we had an example of that in one of our practice types the other day, and the typist didn't pick it up, but you could press voir dire for exhibit A, say, briefcase of files, with the full stop at the end, just as in criminal, and you can see it inputs voir dire for us. That's something that we would have to type in manually into the description in criminal. Righty. So that is the exhibits. We come down again and we see here is our adjournments under that little, looks like a little clock and something behind it. Exactly the same as criminal, more or less. You just follow the prompts in here. The same sorts of adjournments are all in here, except it specifies to you what the dash 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 means and what the all evidence concluded means, i.e. it's for magistrates. And then finally, of these little ones, we have a start ruling macro for that square with the slash through it. And we have an end ruling macro. So exactly the same as or in criminal, just different icons. We then have an impanel jury icon over here, so you can do 12 or 6. Obviously, if it's a civil trial, it's going to be 6. And you can see you don't even have to type that in yourself. You can just use the macro. There's also one for bringing in the jury. We just pop in the time, taking out the jury, in the absence of the jury. All of these things we've spoken about in criminal, they're just for civil. Start of the voir dire here. And then these are the little charge macros in the corner, which look like little letters with a pen on it. Same concept as in criminal, just a different macro in civil. And now is a really good point at which to answer a question that I've had over the last few days, which is, if I am typing a criminal matter, can I use the macros from civil? And the answer is, having discussed this with our TCs last night, ideally no. If at all possible, please try and just use the macros in the VGRS word macros for criminal and just use the transcript ones for civil. There's going to be a little bit of overlap. For example, we're always going to use the end of tape from the civil tab, unless you want to manually type in end of tape and then do the spell check yourself. We're always going to use fix format to fix up the formatting, whether or not you're doing criminal or civil. But for the rest, particularly for these trial macros, try and keep to the separate tabs if at all possible. Okie doke. I think I'm going to wrap it up there just for now. We can go over anything else after lunch. Does anyone have any questions before I release you to have a little bit of a look through that practice type? That was a lot of information, I know. Not by the looks of it. Okay, perfect. It is fairly self-explanatory. They're all there. I think it's just good to have a bit of an overview. So what I might do now is just ask that you maybe use the next 15 minutes before lunch, or probably 13 minutes by the time we get there, just to start having a bit of a type of that civil matter that I sent you first, is that first segment of audio in the email last night. Now, you will have noticed that this is a Supreme Court matter and it's also a civil matter. That doesn't really make much difference for you. I just wanted you to see what a Supreme Court room looks like, because it's a bit different to the county court. I wanted you to have a go at using the start and end ruling macros. And I also wanted you to engage with the manual in section 6 a little bit in terms of what we type in the Supreme Court. So just have a little bit of a look in there, because we've mostly been focusing on county. So it's good to have a little look at a Supreme Court matter. And just remember, when you're typing a ruling, there are some conventions that go along with that we discussed yesterday. So if you haven't already, I'd jump into the section on rulings in the manual just to make sure that you're on that. Yeah, so just feel free to do as much as you can before lunch, and then take a well-earned rest from 12:30 to 1:30, at which we'll come back with a little finish off about civil, a little intro to the Magistrates Court, and then we can have Q&A, feedback, concerns, make sure we've got all the resources we need and go from there. Does that sound okay to everybody? Yep. Perfect, thank you. So I always wait an awkward amount of time and then end up speaking through you, so please accept my apologies for that. Alrighty, I will see you in that case at 1:30. Thank you very much and talk soon. Bye.